Do you take pride in teaching a generation about the man?
I do. And I remember that speech written just like that by White, where you're railing against the man.
Jack White has always been one of the most electrifying figures in modern rock. From the stripped-down blues chaos of the White Stripes to the raw power of the raconteurs and his wildly experimental solo work, White has carved out a reputation as both a musical genius and a restless innovator. He's the kind of artist who seems to thrive on pushing boundaries, both in sound and in the way he approaches the industry itself. But for every fan who praises his brilliance, there's a fellow musician who swears they'll never work with him again. Why? Because Jack White isn't just passionate about music. He's fiercely competitive, stubborn, and at times brutally outspoken. His intensity has led to more than a few public battles, heated rivalries, and behind-the-scenes grudges that still ripple through the rock world today. In fact, his reputation as one of rock's last great rebels is tied not just to his groundbreaking songs, but also to his long list of enemies, from explosive email leaks that exposed his personal vendettas, to Twitter feuds that spiraled out of control, to fellow rock stars calling him jealous and childish. Jack White has managed to ignite anger in some of the biggest names in modern music. If there's one feud that defines Jack White's darker side, it's his long-running war with the Black Keys, and particularly with their frontman, Dan Auerbach. What began as subtle tension in the garage rock revival scene eventually escalated into one of the most publicized rivalries in modern rock. And unlike many industry squabbles, this one got personal, very personal. The roots of the feud trace back to the early 2000s. The White Stripes were on top of the rock world, praised for their minimalist sound, blistering live shows, and Jack White's raw guitar heroics. Around the same time, the Black Keys were quietly building momentum with their own stripped-down blues rock style. Critics and fans couldn't help but compare the two bands. Both were duos. Both had a gritty sound. Both were obsessed with Delta blues traditions. But to Jack White, there was a difference. He believed the Black Keys were borrowing too much from his blueprint without giving him credit. For years, White made snide remarks in interviews, hinting at copycats in the rock scene. But the rivalry exploded in 2013, when private emails from White's divorce proceedings were leaked to the public. In them, Jack fumed about Auerbach, accusing him of ripping off his style and even going so far as to complain that his children were attending the same school as Auerbach's. White insisted he didn't want his kids in the same school as his, painting a picture of deep resentment that extended far beyond music. This revelation shocked fans. It wasn't just professional jealousy, it was personal animosity. Auerbach, for his part, tried to play it cool publicly. In interviews, he often avoided Jack's name, but he didn't shy away from calling the feud unfortunate. Still, tensions bubbled beneath the surface. When the Black Keys album Turn Blue was released in 2014, many noted that its lead single, Fever, sounded like a subtle jab at White. Meanwhile, White couldn't resist throwing shade back. During a Rolling Stone interview, he implied that the Black Keys were essentially a watered-down version of the White Stripes, suggesting they lacked originality. The feud reached a boiling point when both acts performed at the same festivals. Rumors swirled about backstage confrontations, and while neither band ever admitted to a physical fight, insiders suggested that security was on high alert whenever they shared a bill. At one point, Auerbach admitted that he avoided certain venues and events just to steer clear of Jack. Over time, the rivalry became symbolic of a broader debate in rock: authenticity versus imitation. Jack White saw himself as a torchbearer for tradition, a purist who believed in strict rules about how music should be created and consumed. The Black Keys, on the other hand, embraced a looser approach, blending blues roots with commercial accessibility. To fans, both bands had merit. But to Jack White, it was a matter of pride, and he couldn't stand the thought of being overshadowed by a band he considered derivative. Interestingly, in later years, White seemed to soften slightly. He acknowledged in one interview that perhaps he'd been too harsh, and that competition sometimes brings out the worst in artists. But the damage was already done. For Auerbach, the bitterness lingered. He once joked in a radio appearance that he and Jack would never grab a beer together, a polite way of saying the feud was permanent. To this day, fans of both the White Stripes and the Black Keys still argue over who truly carried the mantle of modern blues rock. But one thing is certain. Jack White's hatred for Dan Auerbach wasn't just an artistic rivalry. It was a deep, personal grudge that spilled into the public eye and defined an era of rock drama. If Dan Auerbach represented the quiet side of the Black Keys' feud with Jack White, drummer Patrick Carney was the opposite, the loud, sarcastic, and unapologetic half of the duo who had no problem firing back. While Auerbach often avoided directly trashing White in interviews, Carney made a habit of calling him out, turning what might have been a simmering rivalry into an all-out public spectacle. The bad blood between Carney and White came to a head in the mid-2010s. After Jack's divorce emails leaked, exposing his distaste for Auerbach and his accusations of copying, Carney decided he wasn't going to stay silent. On Twitter and in interviews, he openly mocked White, painting him as a bitter, jealous rock star who couldn't stand the success of others. At one point, Carney described White's behavior as childish, saying he needed to grow up and get over himself. Things only escalated from there. When White gave a Rolling Stone interview in 2014, where he once again took shots at the Black Keys without naming them directly, Carney was quick to respond. He tweeted that White's obsession with them was hilarious and accused him of trying to control a narrative that no longer belonged to him. Carney even implied that White's attitude revealed insecurity, as if he couldn't accept that another blues-inspired rock duo had found their own mainstream success. The tension reached a fever pitch when the two musicians reportedly crossed paths at an awards show after-party in New York. Rumors circulated that White confronted Carney, and some accounts suggested that things nearly turned physical. Carney himself later tweeted about the incident, saying Jack had tried to fight him. White's camp denied the accusation, but the story spread like wildfire, cementing their feud as one of rock's most entertaining modern rivalries. Fans joked on social media about a battle of the bands, while critics wondered if the drama was overshadowing the music itself. What made the Carney White feud particularly fascinating was how personal it felt. Unlike Auerbach, who always seemed reluctant to fuel the fire, Carney relished the role of antagonist. He knew how to provoke, and he didn't mind turning White into the butt of his jokes. In one interview, Carney quipped that White's obsession with the Black Keys reminded him of a high school ex who just can't move on. Comments like this not only stung, but they also painted White as someone trapped in grudges while others had moved forward. For Carney, the feud was less about music and more about principle. He bristled at the idea that White viewed himself as a gatekeeper of authenticity in rock and roll. In Carney's eyes, no one owned the blues, no one owned garage rock, and no one had the authority to dictate who was original or not. That's why he often accused White of hypocrisy, pointing out that the White Stripes themselves drew heavily from early blues pioneers, yet White seemed to ignore his own influences while condemning others. Over time, the feud cooled slightly, though not because Carney suddenly had kind words for White. Rather, the drummer seemed to lose interest in stoking the fire, admitting in later interviews that he'd rather focus on making music than sparring with someone he considered stuck in the past. Still, he never fully backtracked on his earlier comments, leaving little doubt that his disdain for White ran deep. In the end, Carney's role in the feud gave fans something rare, a rock star who wasn't afraid to clap back at one of the industry's most intimidating figures. Where others stayed silent about Jack White's controlling competitive nature, Patrick Carney put it on blast. And in doing so, he secured his place on the list of rockers who not only clashed with Jack White, but openly hated him. The early 2000s saw a wave of rock revivalists storm onto the charts. Bands like The Strokes, The White Stripes, and The Killers redefined what rock could sound like for a new generation. But with all those egos, styles, and sounds clashing in the spotlight, rivalries were bound to emerge. Among them was one of the most unexpected and bitter feuds, the tension between Brandon Flowers, frontman of the Killers, and Jack White. For Flowers, the rivalry was as much about image as it was about sound. While the White Stripes embodied a raw, minimalist garage rock ethos, the Killers leaned into glam, synths, and big stadium-ready anthems. Flowers once criticized White's stripped-down aesthetic, suggesting that it was less pure artistry and more of a carefully constructed gimmick. He implied that the White Stripes' reliance on red, white, and black visuals, and the choice to only have two members, felt more like branding than genuine expression. Jack White didn't take these kinds of comments lightly. Known for his sharp tongue and unshakable sense of superiority when it came to rock authenticity, he reportedly saw Flowers' remarks as proof of the Killers being a pop band masquerading as rock. In interviews, White often dismissed the synth-heavy sound of bands like the Killers, hinting that they represented style over substance. The feud heated up when the Killers began rising to international fame with their 2004 debut, Hot Fuss. Songs like Mr. Brightside and Somebody Told Me made them global icons practically overnight. At the same time, the White Stripes were solidifying their reputation as critical darlings, hailed for Elephant and the Monster Single Seven Nation Army. The parallel trajectories naturally set up comparisons and tensions. Critics often framed them as rivals, the flashy Las Vegas upstarts versus the brooding, authentic Detroit duo, Brandon Flowers, never one to hold back, further fanned the flames when he expressed frustration at how critics fawned over White while dismissing the Killers' music as commercial. In his eyes, there was a double standard. Why was Jack White celebrated for mining old blues traditions while the Killers were mocked for blending rock with glam and pop? For Flowers, it smacked of elitism, and Jack White was the face of it. While the feud didn't devolve into physical altercations like Jack's conflict with Patrick Carney, it simmered in interviews and press statements. Both men used the media to throw subtle and sometimes not-so-subtle jabs at each other. Flowers would talk about bands who pretend to be minimalists but secretly care about selling a look, while White would describe bands that rely on synthesizers to cover up the lack of songwriting. To fans, it was clear who they were referencing. Interestingly, the Killers' massive mainstream success may have been what truly irked Jack White. While White relished being seen as a true artist, Flowers and the Killers were selling out arenas, topping charts and dominating radio airplay in ways the White Stripes never quite matched. To White, commercial dominance wasn't the same as artistic credibility, but to Flowers, it was proof that people connected with their songs. Regardless of critical snobbery, over time the feud cooled, with both men largely moving on to focus on their own projects. But even years later, Brandon Flowers has admitted in interviews that he never felt embraced by Jack White or his circle of rock revivalists. The White Stripes, the Strokes, and their ilk seemed to form a cool kids club, and Flowers always felt the Killers were outsiders to that world. The rivalry between Jack White and Brandon. Flowers revealed something larger about rock in the 2000s. It wasn't just about music, it was about identity. Jack White wanted to be the gatekeeper of authenticity, while Brandon Flowers wanted to prove that flash, style, and stadium-ready spectacle could be just as valid. And in that clash of philosophies, Flowers became yet another rocker who, at least for a time, seemed to truly hate Jack White. If there's one feud that truly defines Jack White's reputation for hostility, it's his long-running battle with Dan Auerbach, guitarist and frontman of the Black Keys. Unlike some rivalries in rock that burn hot and fade fast, this one dragged on for years, spilling out into leaked emails, bitter interviews, and awkward moments at award shows. For many fans, Auerbach is the ultimate example of a rocker who genuinely despises Jack White. The roots of their feud stretch back to the early 2000s, when both the White Stripes and the Black Keys were emerging from the underground garage blues scene. Both acts built their sound on raw guitar riffs, pounding drums, and a throwback approach to the blues. To some critics, the Black Keys were the natural successors to what the White Stripes had started. But to Jack White, they were something else entirely. Imitators. Jack White has never been shy about his opinions. Behind the scenes, he reportedly complained that the Black Keys were copying his style, siphoning off attention and success that should have belonged to him. His anger boiled over in 2013 when a series of personal emails were leaked during his messy divorce from Karen Elson. In one email, White explicitly told his ex-wife that he didn't want their kids attending the same school as Dan Auerbach's child. He claimed it was too uncomfortable and accused Auerbach of stealing his sound, his fans, and even his career momentum. The email leak was explosive. Fans and journalists pounced on White's words, painting him as bitter, jealous, and unable to handle competition. Auerbach himself rarely commented publicly, but the few times he did, his words dripped with restrained resentment. In one interview, when asked about White's insults, Auerbach dryly responded, "I don't have any interest in talking about that man." For Auerbach, silence became his weapon, a refusal to fuel White's public tantrums. The tension wasn't just private, it was visible in the industry. At award shows, cameras caught moments where White and Auerbach avoided each other entirely. Insiders whispered about backstage cold shoulders, icy glares, and industry figures forced to choose sides. Even though both men continued to thrive, the White Stripes' legacy cemented by Seven Nation Army and the Black Keys dominating the 2010s with albums like Brothers and El Camino. The feud never fully disappeared. For Jack White, the resentment seemed rooted in a deep insecurity. Despite his undeniable talent and originality, he couldn't stomach the idea that another duo, also rooted in blues, also stripped down, also guitar and drums, was finding massive success. For Dan Auerbach, the feud was almost insulting. The Black Keys had carved their own path, with a grittier, looser, and more soulful take on garage rock. To be dismissed as copycats by White wasn't just unfair, it was petty. The most telling part of their rivalry is how differently each man handled it. White lashed out in emails and interviews, making himself look spiteful and insecure. Auerbach, on the other hand, kept his anger controlled, letting White's words hang in the air without response. In many ways, his quiet resentment was more powerful than any direct insult. He didn't need to tear Jack down. The public was already watching White do it to himself. In the years since, there have been rumors that the two men have buried the hatchet, or at least moved past open hostility. Yet the tension lingers in rock, history as one of the defining rivalries of the 2000s. Dan Auerbach's calm refusal to engage with White's bitterness became its own form of resistance, a quiet declaration that he wouldn't let Jack's insecurity control the narrative. For Jack White, it was a reminder that even a genius can't control how others perceive him. And for Dan Auerbach, it cemented a reputation as the man who took the high road, while still quietly resenting the competitor who tried to drag him into the mud.